So the topic of my talk for the next 30 minutes or so is 7 steps towards creativity or creative thinking in the classroom. You can see my website there is johnhugheselt.com. I'll also give you more contact details at the end. I'll also be giving you references. So anything that I mention during this session, I'll be giving you links to the books and the online materials later on. Let's get going. There are basically 7 steps or 7 stages in my presentation. It'll all become fairly clear how that works as we go along. Creativity is, of course, a hot topic these days. It's one of the 21st century skills, one of the 4 C's. But it's quite interesting when you ask people about creativity, and particularly creativity in the classroom. Everybody seems to agree that it's very important. Perhaps we aren't quite all so clear or in agreement of exactly what it is. So I'd like to begin by defining creativity. That needs to be our first step, to define exactly what it is. And one of the best known definitions of creativity is what's sometimes referred to as big C and little c. Now, big C, creativity, thinks of creativity in terms of the great creative thinkers of our time. So we might refer to people like Picasso or Mozart and so on, and concern ourselves with what's the end product, what is the great work that is produced at the end. And in a way, creativity like that, in terms of its impact on English language teachers, well, not all of our students are going to be great poets, though some of them may become great poets or great writers. We never know who we're teaching in the classroom. But for a lot of our students, creativity is more something that they will apply to their language learning in order to make it more memorable, or to help them solve a problem in some way. And this links more to the idea of little c, a view of creativity, or what we might call creative thinking, which is much more tied up to the notion of creativity and creative thinking in the sense of 21st century skills. That creativity or creative thinking is a tool which we use to maybe solve problems, to generate ideas, to help us achieve something. And the end product is less important in terms of big C creative thinking. We're more interested in the processes of how we get somewhere, how we solve something. So we're more interested in sort of divergent thinking and problem solving. And perhaps little c creativity is much more relevant to us as language teachers. But I'm going to explore these two ideas of creativity as we go along. I'd like to stay, first of all, with this idea of small c creative thinking, that creativity is about the process of learning. Which brings me pretty quickly to step 2. What is creative thinking and how does it relate to the language classroom? One view of creative thinking is that it's about divergent thinking. And in a very good book by McGregor, she illustrates the idea of divergent thinking, or this view of creative thinking, as problem solving. It's thinking outside the box. So we've got our thought bubble and we're thinking beyond our limitations. We're trying to solve problems, deal with situations, cope with issues, or solve certain needs or tasks or challenges by applying some divergent thinking, typically to think outside the box. And in studies of creative thinking, of course, there are all sorts of tests that are used to test divergent thinking. Perhaps one of the best known tests is the paperclip test. If you were here with me in the room at the moment, I might try the paperclip test with you. I might say, in 1 minute, how many different ways can you think of to use a paperclip other than for clipping 2 bits of paper together? Can you think of some alternative ways? Let me give you 10 seconds and just think of one alternative way. Okay, you might have come up with different, and over time I've heard all sorts of suggestions. One way is that a paperclip is useful with your iPhone for pushing out the battery, or a paperclip can be turned into jewelry, or a paperclip can be used as a scratcher in some way, or a paperclip can be used to scratch marks into something. The list is seemingly endless, and some theories of divergent thinking would say that really genius level divergent thinking, the type of level that you might expect to see in a NASA astronaut, for example, would mean that you could come up with between maybe 150 to 200 ideas, different ways of using a paperclip, and that this in some way is a measure of your divergent or creative thinking. In fact, many of you will be familiar with Ken Robinson's TED Talk on creativity, and in it he talks about how schools, our traditional notion of education, is killing creativity. Now, there have been tests to suggest that if you give children a divergent thinking task, so if we gave children the paperclip divergent thinking test, young children might come up with maybe 100 different ways of using the paperclip. And then if you give the same test to adolescent students or teenage students, they might come up with maybe 50 to 100, but they'd come up with fewer ideas of how to use the paperclip test. And then if you give the test to adults, once we've finished our schooling, our education, we may only come up with 20 to 25. And there have been various attempts to prove this and therefore indicate that somehow education limits our creativity over time. The way we educate is counterproductive to our creative thinking. Now, there's lots of arguments to support it, but there's probably plenty of arguments that may question it. For example, I think adults over time are also developing their critical thinking skills and questioning skills. So even before they've suggested the creative idea, they've already thought of reasons why it won't work. And I think that comes into creativity and creative thinking, as we'll see a little later on. Nonetheless, divergent thinking is important in the language classroom. Let me share with you some what I might categorize as divergent thinking type classroom activities. Brainstorming typically would be one. For example, if you were going to start the lesson and the topic of the lesson was transportation, or the problems of transportation in modern cities, you might ask students to brainstorm everything they know on the subject of transport, simply to get them thinking about the topic and to find out what vocabulary they have and to get their ideas going. Imagination activities, asking students to imagine a situation, is something we might typically do. And even if students don't have prior experience of certain situations or topics, quite often we expect them to try to imagine what it might be like to be in a certain situation. Typically, when we're teaching conditional tenses, we ask students, for example, to imagine, what would you do if you won $1 million? And although most of us have never won $1 million, many of us can imagine what it might be like. Typically, creative thinking or divergent thinking questions don't have right-wrong answers. They're not true-false questions. They're not yes-no questions. They tend to be open-ended, and there is no correct answer, which means that creative and divergent thinking is quite hard to test, because tests and assessment, they don't like asking questions where there isn't a wrong or right answer, particularly in these days where we're using technology a lot to assess students. Activities that encourage originality. Originality is synonymous with creativity. And it's all about generating new ideas or something that somebody hasn't thought of before. And often creative thinking tasks are linked to productive skills. So quite often we will finish a lesson by asking students to create something in order to generate speaking practice or to generate writing practice. Divergent creative thinking is synonymous with those kinds of activities where we want students to speak, maybe a role play activity, or we want them to write a story, for example, and use their imagination. To give you another concrete example of a divergent thinking task, here's one that I wrote recently, a series I'm working on called World Link, which will be coming out next year. I was doing some vocabulary work on describing famous and creative people. So the topic was creativity, but I also wanted students to use their creativity. So I gave them what is a kind of a brainstorming activity in which you write the name of the famous person across a piece of paper. So you write Einstein, for example, and then you brainstorm words that describe that famous creative person. And then you run those words off the name. Now, there's different ways of doing this activity. A student can take the name of the famous person and they can write all the words themselves. Or the student can write the name of a famous person on a piece of paper and they write one of the words, like creativity, and then they pass the piece of paper to the person on their right. They take another piece of paper from the person on their left, and that person has written a different famous name, and they think of a different word. So it's a kind of a group activity in which students are trying to generate and think of new words. So there's an element of divergent and creative thinking, but with the limitation that students are working with the language they have. So it's not total divergent thinking, but it is an element of it that's thinking outside the box. But I think one important thing that this activity illustrates, other than that it's great for practicing recycling vocabulary, is that it gives students a limitation. And one of my arguments with creative thinking is that most effective creative thinking isn't just about thinking outside the box, it's also about thinking inside the box. And in the classroom, it's important to set limitations. In fact, there's many books on the topic of creativity that would argue that actually adding constraints to a student will encourage greater creativity. So adding limitations can be an effective way of getting students to create more. I think if you want to draw parallels here with some of the great creative thinkers, their best work, their best music, their best literature, their best poetry was written during times of hardship, or times when there was perhaps political limitations or social limitations put upon them, and that's when they produced their best work. In a sense, they're having to think inside the box. Let's go back to McGregor and show how she represents this. Earlier, I showed your diagram that she has for creative or divergent thinking. For this thinking inside the box, what we're talking about here is critical thinking or convergent thinking. We're applying our analytical, our evaluative skills to something, to analyze something, and then learning from those limitations to do something creative with them. So if critical thinking is all about thinking inside the box, it's about analyzing and evaluating the information and data to hand, and then learning from that and then applying it in a creative thinking way. To give you one of my favorite examples, the musician David Bowie, who I like in particular, he once said some of the best music he ever listens to, or the music he chose to listen to, was only the music he could steal from. And he talked about stealing like an artist. Also, Picasso said art is theft. And what they were saying was that good artists, good creative people are also great critical thinkers. They're great at looking at other work, identifying what it is that makes it successful or effective, and then applying it to their own creative thinking. And I think there's an element of truth to that when we're helping students learn languages and they're using their creativity in the classroom. Let me give you some examples of what I mean here. So here we've got, earlier I listed some typical activities for divergent thinking. I think when we think about convergent thinking or thinking inside the box, in the classroom, we want to encourage students to develop their skills to analyze and evaluate ideas, other people's ideas. So they might read a text or listen to a song or watch a video and learn ideas from it. Giving students activities with limitations. For example, if we've just taught students 8 or 10 new words, we might say to them for homework, I want you to write me a story, 100-word story, but you must use all 8 to 10 of those new words. Now, if I ask a student just to write a 100-word story with no guidance, no title or anything, no limitations, most people would find that quite difficult to do. I would find it difficult. Whereas if you said to me, write a 100-word story, you must use these 8 words, instantly I would find connections between those 8 words and I would construct a story around it. So limitations are very positive. Convergent thinking often has answers with a correct answer. There are right, wrong answers. There's often a good way of writing a story, for example, and if students analyze and answer questions about a story, they'll learn how to structure it and then write a good one themselves. Activities that encourage imitation are also really important. It's going back to the David Bowie example, this idea of stealing like an artist. It's like imitating like an artist, so that you're learning from good models of other writing or good models of speaking, for example. And I also think convergent or critical thinking is often linked to the receptive skills. It often involves reading and listening. For example, reading a text and identifying what makes the writing good writing. So if you want students to write a certain type of text type, like an argumentative essay, to have them read a good model of an argumentative essay and analyze what it is that makes it good, maybe the structure, the connecting language, the way the author plans it. Developing those reading skills are important for convergent thinking, because then they can apply what they've learned to their divergent thinking, to their creative thinking. Similarly, if students have to create a presentation, showing them models of good presentations and listening to how the presenter uses language effectively is really helpful for their own speaking. Here are a couple of more concrete examples. For example, thinking inside the box, maybe giving students reading texts about creativity or creative thinkers. This was a text I really liked, I used in World English. It was about fashion, the fashion world, and creative thinkers in the fashion world. And a woman who'd taken a type of fashion that was very popular in parts of Bolivia and repurposing elements of that fashion to create a new type of fashion that you might see on fashion catwalks around the world. It's a good example of getting students to think critically about creative ideas. And you never know, it might encourage a student in the class who's interested in clothes and fashion to then go off and think about how could they take an existing idea from fashion and do something else with it. That kind of text about creativity is a really nice way into the topic of creativity. If you also want to get students being creative at an everyday level, one activity teachers often use at lower levels, and I did this with some lower level material in World English, is that students listen to quite a formulaic conversation, and then they practice reading the dialogue aloud. And then they have to read the dialogue again, but they have to replace certain language with their own ideas. So in this dialogue, with the underlined words, they add in their own words to make the conversation their own, to make it personal. And although that's quite a limiting activity, there is an element of divergent or creative thinking, but you're giving them a structure to work within. So even students at low levels should get that opportunity to be creative with language and to personalize it. And personalization, for me, personalization and creativity have so much in common. When we ask students to personalize language, quite often we're also asking them to be creative. Here's another example of that type of thing from a writing lesson. This is from a writing lesson on clothing. Students are given, in exercise D on the screen, students are given examples of writing from a clothing app where they might buy secondhand clothing online. They then analyze the language that's used, in particular the way adjectives are used, an adjective order. And then, of course, at the end of the lesson, they then have to write their own advertisement about some clothing they want to sell. So that's where the creative thinking comes in. So they're going from sort of divergent or critical thinking, the analysis of the way the writing is structured, and by the end of the lesson, they're more onto divergent thinking and creative thinking. But I don't think the two things are separable. I think when we think about creativity as a whole, we can't think of it as something separate from critical or divergent thinking or convergent thinking. They're really interconnected. So I see them very much as a whole. And if I'm talking about creative thinking, I'm also thinking about where does the convergent or critical thinking come into the lesson structure. You can't have one without the other. Point 4, step 4. This comes from an idea from Ken Robinson, who wrote a book called Out of Our Minds. It's a really interesting book about creativity. But one of the techniques that he suggests for encouraging creativity to solve problems in particular, or in the classroom, is to break your habitual patterns of thinking, or to break out of your routines. And I would say this is very true for teachers as it is for students. Quite often, I don't think you can have creative thinking students if you don't have a creative thinking teacher. And I think as teachers, it's important for us to challenge our habits and our routines. So when we're typically planning a lesson, it's easy, particularly if you've been teaching a long time, it's easy to sort of fall into the trap of doing the same thing all the time and falling into routines. So when he talks about breaking habitual patterns of thinking, he's suggesting that, you know, sometimes when we go into a lesson and we're going to do our normal type of lesson, try something different and see what happens. Let me give you a real example of this. I was teaching a class with my pre-intermediate students. They're a kind of mixed ability. They're kind of elementary A1 to A2 level students in Oxford, near where I live. And I was going to do the lesson on, it was the grammar lesson really, on have to, don't have to, can, can't. Now you've probably all taught this lesson. The way my lesson typically works, and this example comes from my book Life, is that students read a text about rules for visitors and tourists to Australia. So it's talking about what kind of visa do you need, and what side of the road do you drive on, and what kind of things must you have to, in terms of currency and the weather and so on. So it's tips for tourists. Students read the text, they check they understand it, and then we analyze the grammar in the text, and they discover that it's full of sentences with have to, don't have to, can, can't. Now, typically, the next stage in my lesson, if I taught this lesson the way I've been teaching it for the last 20 years or so, I would probably finish the class by saying to students, write sentences about your own country, about what you have to do or don't have to do, what you can do, can't do. That'd be fine. It's just sometimes it gets slightly boring for me because I know what's coming, because I've taught the lesson so many times. And also for students, sometimes students don't want to just write about the country they're from. They want to do something different. So in this particular lesson, I thought, well, I'll change my routine. I'll break out of my normal habit. And instead I put the students into groups of 3. And each group, I said to them, I want you to think of a new name for your country. And I want you to think of new rules that you have to do in your country, or things that you don't have to do, or things that you can or can't do. And at first, some of the students found this quite hard because they just had to think of the name of a new country. And some students were thinking, well, what do you mean the name of a new country? But eventually they did. And if you've got groups of 3, some students are slightly more thinking outside of the box than others, and they're being more creative, and some are thinking inside the box, as you'll see. Well, with this particular class, these are the names of the countries that 3 groups of students came up. One group called their group Sea Island, which sounded very nice. Another group couldn't think of a name, so they kind of used their convergent thinking and thought, well, 2 of us are from Moldova, 1 of us is from Syria, let's call our country Syria. And the 3rd group overheard what the 2nd group were calling themselves, and they had somebody from Brazil, somebody from Romania, somebody from Italy, so they created a country called Italy. You see what I mean about using your convergent thinking to think creatively. That's a good example of that. Now let's take a look at the rules that they came up with on Sea Island. Sea Island sounds fantastic because you can swim with the dolphins and you don't have to pay taxes. Sounds fantastic. I'd love to live on Sea Island. Syria was slightly more, what should we say, slightly more right-wing. The rules were quite firm. You have to study English. You can't have a car. You have to have a bicycle. You know, quite strong. It felt a bit more like the police had a lot more control in Syria. But nice examples. And Italy, this is my favorite actually. I thought they were really using the divergent thinking and breaking the habitual patterns of thinking. In the morning, you have to drive on the right, and in the evening, you have to drive on the left. Lovely piece of creative thinking, using the grammar and not requiring particularly high-level English. There's a mistaken idea that creativity requires upper intermediate or advanced level English. Not true. Your elementary, pre-intermediate students, full of creative ideas. They just need that opportunity to use the language they have. But that lesson only happened because I broke my own personal habit and routine. I just thought, well, I'll do something different for a change. And I think we need to be doing that on a kind of regular basis. Just try something new. Sometimes it might fail, but rarely the outcomes can be more interesting when we try to break our habitual patterns of thinking. Okay, step number 5, asking higher order thinking questions. Now, all of you, if I mention the word Bloom's taxonomy, know that we're talking about lower and higher order thinking, and lower order thinking is about remembering, understanding, and applying. And higher order thinking is about analyzing, evaluating, and creating. At the highest order skill is creative thinking. And arguably, you can only really have creative thinking going on in the classroom if the students have the opportunity to be asked higher order thinking questions, or have the opportunity themselves to ask higher order thinking questions. And I think one of the things we perhaps fail to do as teachers, in fact, I know this to be true because I've observed many lessons, and I would say the vast majority, by a mile, of questions that are asked are lower order thinking questions. Now, there are good reasons for that. A lot of lower order thinking questions have to be asked in a lesson because they're linked with classroom management. But let's take a look at some data. There are various studies into the types of questions we ask in the classroom, but RAG did some research at in 2001, and what this study was a study of two types of lessons in the secondary school system in the UK. Not in ELT classrooms, but I think the results indicate what we would probably find out. First of all, they discovered that in a typical teaching day, when they recorded teachers, they discovered that most teachers ask about 2 questions per minute. So that's about 400 questions you're asking per day, approximately, okay? In a year, that's 70,000 questions a year. And if you're teaching for 20 to 30 years over the life of your career, that's potentially 2 to 4 million questions you've asked in your life. I don't know how that makes you feel. That makes me feel old, I think. When they started to measure the types of questions, the really shocking data, I think it's shocking, is that only between 4 to 8% of the questions were higher order thinking questions. So there were questions without right, wrong answers. Typically, the questions, over 90% of the questions were questions where the teacher was expecting a correct or incorrect answer. They also measured the time that teachers left after they'd asked a question. Now, this is one of those things that we learn on teacher training courses when we're a new teacher. If you think back to when you were a new teacher, in the stressful moment of being a new teacher is when you ask a question, you typically ask the question, you wait 1 second, and then you think, oh, nobody knows the answer, and you start talking. Whereas actually, we know that our language students need longer than a second because they might know the answer, but they have to think of the words they're going to use and to formulate the answer. What they found in this study was that if it was a lower order thinking question, they then told teachers you need to wait at least 3 seconds. And if it was a higher order, wait at least 10 seconds. Remembering that this data comes from a secondary school in the UK where the student's first language was English in most cases. So if we applied this same rule to the language classroom, I would say allow maybe at least 5 seconds sometimes for a lower order thinking question, and much more than 10 seconds. In fact, with higher order thinking questions, quite often we put students in pairs or groups to discuss their answers first, and then they report back on their answers because they need so much more time to process their ideas and then to formulate the language they're going to need. The other striking thing was that in a typical lesson that they monitored, students got to ask 1 question per lesson. So, I mean, I've observed lessons where some students never got to ask a question. But I think this is really, if we're going to encourage creative thinking in the classroom, there has to be that moment where the students generate their own questions. That has to be part of it. And I think this data, all it does is serve to highlight that we really need to think about our own lessons. And one thing I would recommend you do is record your lesson sometimes. Just press the record button on your phone or recording device, and then just listen to the types of questions you're asking in any lesson. And it's quite striking what you'll discover that you're doing. So for creative thinking to happen in the classroom, more higher order thinking questions from the teacher and more opportunities for the students to ask those questions. While we're on the subject of questions, I thought I'd just drop in an example of how this might work. And I've been, like you probably, I've been teaching lessons online recently because of coronavirus, and I've been using Zoom. And recently I had a one-to-one student, and of course you have lots of flexibility in one-to-one classes, but she mentioned to me that she wanted to go for some job interviews in English. So using Zoom, in the chat box in Zoom, while we were talking through the video, we started to brainstorm the type of questions she might get. And at the top of the screen, I've cut the screen from the chat box there, and I've been typing in the questions she might be asked at the interview. But so she was suggesting the language, and I was reformulating the questions to give her correct questions, if you like. And then we role played the interview using the questions that we created between us. And she tried to formulate answers that she might give. And while I was listening, this particular student, she had a lot of problems with pronunciation. Her first language was Chinese. So of course that she had problems with English stress timing and getting word stress right. Her English was really quite high level, but she wanted to work on pronunciation, and that was affecting her intelligibility. So you can see there, I've typed in, after the questions, I've started to type in words that she's saying, and in using capital letters, I've highlighted the syllable that she needs to stress. Or for example, she had a particular problem with the word quality. And that's just an example of online teaching using the chat box. But my main point of it is that the questions are coming from the student. She's generating those questions, and we're being creative with the language and giving her imagining situations of how she's going to deal with it. In terms of higher order thinking questions for creativity, these are the types of questions we might ask as teachers, or the types of questions we should encourage our students to ask each other. Questions like, what else? How could you make it better? What would happen if? And so on. Those are higher order thinking type questions. Okay, the last two steps I have left are much quicker. I think for students to use their higher order thinking skills and to use creative thinking skills, you have to allow thinking time. It goes back to that idea of, if you ask a question, you've got to allow maybe 10 seconds or 20 or even a couple of minutes for the students to think about their answers. So far, I've only talked about creativity in the classroom during the lesson time. And I'd like to talk about what happens outside of the classroom time. But first of all, an interesting question that was asked in a survey. There was a survey of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So these are very creative people. They're people who run massive companies, and they're constantly having to come up with creative solutions and strategies to solve problems and to move these massive companies forward. And they were asked the question in a survey on creative thinking. They were asked, when and where do you have your most creative thoughts? You know, when do you do your real thinking time? And their answers were really telling. If I ask you that question, where do you come up with your most creative solutions or your most creative thoughts? Just have a quick think. Where would you say typically? Let me share with you their answers. When and where do you have your most creative ideas? The top 3 answers in the survey were on vacation. So not during paid working time, but while they're sitting next to the pool on holiday. In the shower, in the bath, the typical answers, we all remember the eureka moment when he's in the bath and he suddenly finds the solution and goes, eureka. That's where we have creative ideas. And also this one, traveling to and from work. And I thought what was really interesting about this response is that no one answered at work. No one had creative ideas while they're at work. Now, obviously some people did, and it depends on the creative ideas, but a lot of the answers were not happening during working time or at work. And I started to think, well, is this true of the classroom? If we ask students to do something creative, should we be allowing more creative thinking time at home rather than demanding it in the classroom? So when we set project work, or we give students a homework task. We don't always want to give them exercises out of the workbook or yes, no, true, false type questions. They're very useful. Lower order thinking questions are just as important as higher order thinking questions. But sometimes I think students need to go off and think about it overnight, like we all do. When we have a problem at work as teachers, sometimes we have to sleep on it, or the answer to a solution doesn't come to us for a couple of days. When I'm writing course books, I know sometimes I just get stuck. I need to go to bed. I need to come back to the desk the following day. And even then I might not have the solution or the creative idea and maybe have to wait another day. And our students have the same thing. So creativity needs to happen at home sometimes, and for the students to really come up with their best, most creative work. Tip number 7, share like an artist. All I mean here is that the best artists, the best creators, part of creativity is about sharing your work. If you write something, you want to publish it. If you paint something, you want to hang it on a wall or share it on a blog or put it on Instagram and let people see it. If you're a filmmaker, you want people to watch your video. It's part of the creative process. In the same way, when we ask students to do something creative, I do think it's valuable to encourage students to share their work. If students are embarrassed at first or they're worried about the level of English, maybe you take baby steps. First of all, they write something and you read it and give feedback. But then maybe the next time they write something and they share it with their partner until they get to the point where they're happy for anybody to read their work. Ways in which we can share like an artist in the classroom. We can do poster presentations. So maybe we've done a project in groups and we get students to put their ideas on a poster and they hang it on the wall. Maybe we write a story or a poem and we let other people read it. Or even some, I've met schools where they publish. It's easy to self-publish books now, so you can publish a story or a poem. If they write a dialogue, they could perform it, do a little play. They could record and show a video. It's easy for students to make their own videos or take a photo and share it. Maybe if you have a closed group in Facebook or in Edmodo or an online tool, students can share their photos. Show and tell presentations are a particular favorite of mine. The image you can see on the screen there, it's a Russian speaker. She's excellent level of English. She was talking about a dress, an object that was very important to her. It was a dress that her mother made. We loved her presentation so much. We made a video of it and put it in my book Life Elementary as one of the videos. So students watch the show and tell video and then they have a go at doing their own video. That's an example of students using their convergent thinking, watching the presentation, thinking what's good about the presentation. Okay, now I'll go off and do my own. Or simply a low-tech solution to all of this is just to pin your work on the wall of the classroom or post it on the class blog and let other people read your work or see your work. That's all I mean by like sharing like an artist, but it's nice to have that final stage in the lesson where everybody shares the work they've been doing, and you need to create a classroom environment that welcomes that kind of creative thinking. Okay, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope it's been useful. If you're interested in, quite a few ideas came from the series of World English. The new edition is now out from National Geographic Learning. It includes some TED Talks. It includes some new video content. You'll also see the link there for webinars from National Geographic Learning. And also the InFocus blog. I've written quite a few blog posts on using video, but also blog posts on creativity in the classroom. So you'll find various blog posts that link to what I've been saying in this talk. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was useful, and I hope you have a great rest of your virtual conference. I'll say bye for now.